What do you think about when you hear the name Machiavelli? Do you think about the Borgias, or the Assassin's Creed, or Tupac Shakur? Or more likely, you think about a figure of base malevolence and cunning, the ends justifying the means. I mean, that's the definition of the word Machiavellian, isn't it? We call our most amoral politicians Machiavellian, particularly if they're exceptionally plotting or cunning. But where does this notion come from, and how has it survived the 500 years since Machiavelli was alive? Mostly, it comes from this line in his landmark political treatise, The Prince. It's much safer to be feared than loved. This is probably Machiavelli's most infamous line, and it's probably what he's best known for. Even if you don't know who Machiavelli is, you've probably heard this line. But when we hear this, we're not getting it in the full context of his work. We're not even hearing it in its own context, because what Machiavelli tells us here is that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. That is, the ideal leader is both feared and loved. He is respected. So Machiavelli tells us time and time again that the worst thing for any regime to be is hated. There's nothing more dangerous to the stability of a regime than the hatred of its people. Any regime will have enemies, and a hated regime will naturally have the most enemies looking for weaknesses to exploit. And so, I wanted to write a book about Machiavelli. I have just completed a graphic novel about Machiavelli, which I researched, wrote, drew, and posted online, which I hope to get beyond this caricature. Something about the injustice of it struck me, that this great thinker should have such a malign and undeserved reputation. The idea that we have of Machiavelli as some sort of moral monster is not really correct. You know, he's not history's greatest monster, and that's something I wanted to fix. So, and the image of him as exalting the despot is exactly backwards. Machiavelli was actually a big fan of the Republic. He believed that the citizens in the aggregate were wiser than a prince and made better decisions. He also believed that the Republic was better at adapting change due to the diversity of opinions and backgrounds of the citizens that made up it, and thus was more stable over the long run. In the academic setting, this view is uncontroversial, but in popular depictions of Machiavelli, like on the Borgias on TV, the old caricature persists. Machiavelli is portrayed as a paragon of his own adjective, always whispering some sort of dark advice into the ear of power. But the fact of the matter is that Machiavelli was not particularly Machiavellian, at least in his own career. He wasn't very good at advancing his own career. He wasn't very good at navigating the internal politics of the Florentine government in the Renaissance in which he worked. He was loyal to his government. He worked as an envoy and a diplomat to the Republican Florentine government of the early 16th century. And when that government was overthrown by the Medici, when they returned to power in a coup, he lost everything. He was picked up as an enemy of the state. He was thrown into prison where he was tortured and then banished to the countryside where he wrote his political treatises because he could no longer work in government. Now, at this point, when things were in the balance, when the Medici were marching on Florence and things were at their darkest, he probably could have gone over to the other side. He probably could have betrayed the Republic, but he did not. He stood by them. And so I set out to make a comic book about it. Now, I like working in old school materials. I like working with dip pens on old watercolor paper. I like working with inks and pens, whatnot. And so I wanted to make, but I also wanted to make an art style that evoked Machiavelli's time, but that was also suited to me and the kind of art that I wanted to make. In this age of electronic comics, and nowadays most comic books are drawn almost completely in computer, this has made me a bit of an outsider as well. So the more low-tech my artwork has become, interestingly enough, the more I've relied on high-tech methods to distribute it, to get it in front of people. I'll draw on paper, scan, upload to the web, and then I'll publicize on Facebook and Twitter in order to get it in front of people's eyes. And the more I look into the new tablet and ebook formats, the more I think to myself, you know what's really going to look great on this? It's hand-drawn artwork. So my book begins when Machiavelli enters public service for Florence, and it ends at about the time when he begins to write The Prince. Although the dialogue is invented, although wherever possible I have tried to base it on period accounts of discussions that he had, I've taken all the captions and based those on Machiavelli's writing. They show Machiavelli, his letters both from him to his friends, colleagues, and their letters to him show Machiavelli as a decent man who stood by his friends and colleagues. I wanted to show Machiavelli as a friend, as a colleague, as a father and a husband, and to get beyond this idea of the evil man. And that is the story that I wanted to tell. That's the historical inaccuracy that I wanted to correct. Machiavelli was more statesman than schemer. He was more philosopher than plotter. He was loyal. He didn't backstab anyone. It's a great irony that Machiavelli's great misfortune, his banishment, became such a stroke of luck for world literature. It's likely that had Machiavelli gone over to the Medici and betrayed his state, he may have been able to keep his post in government, and it's likely that The Prince and the discourses would never have been written. That irony of his story is what drew me to Machiavelli in the first place. That and the fact of his rise, his fall, and eventual redemption through world literature makes for a great narrative. He never told us that cruelty and duplicity are virtues. He tells us not to be cruel so that we're not hated. He tells us that we as a people make better decisions than any monarch, and that working together we can make a better decisions than a prince. Demand respect. Do not be overcautious. Go and do what needs doing, because fortune will favor you for it, even if it's in a method that you weren't anticipating. Machiavelli is criticized for describing the harsh realities of rulership, but you will make better decisions if you see things as they are and not as you wish they were. I commend myself to you. Be happy. Thank you.